The disaster did not occur simultaneously, but rather arrived with the sluggish, devastating certainty of a glacier calving into the ocean. Yet, if one were compelled to identify the precise second the ice fractured, it was 11:47 in the morning. 17 minutes was all it required. Just 17 minutes into an interrogation session that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar had struggled for, demanded, and advertised as the moment she would reveal the FBI's depravity. Instead, she remained seated and motionless, her posture bent forward, a mobile phone pressed so firmly against her ear that her knuckles turned pale. Her attorney, a man who typically projected the assurance of high hourly rates, was whispering frantically, his face a facade of panic. Opposite her, FBI Director Kash Patel sat with his hands clasped neatly atop a red binder, his expression tranquil and almost peaceful. It was the look of a man who had just played a royal flush in a high-stakes card game and was merely waiting for the rest of the table to realize the match was already concluded. The House Oversight Committee chamber, usually a din of shuffling documents, whispering aides, and camera clicks, had fallen completely, terrifyingly silent. It was not the polite quiet of respectful attention, but the frozen, stifling silence of collective shock. 47 million individuals were viewing live across every major network, and C-SPAN servers were buckling under the unprecedented burden. Twitter had failed twice in the last 10 minutes as the algorithm struggled to keep pace with the volume of responses. But none of that mattered in this frozen second. The only thing that mattered was the expression on Ilhan Omar's face, for this was not supposed to occur. She was intended to be the prosecutor, the one asking the difficult questions and grilling Patel on national television about his alleged political persecutions against progressive members of Congress. She had rehearsed the sound bites and prepared the clips for social media. Yet instead, she was the one who could not answer. To comprehend how we reached this cliff, where a sitting Congresswoman's career was imploding in real-time broadcast to the world, we must rewind, not far, just 17 minutes. Chairman Mike Johnson struck the gavel 3 times, the sound echoing through the ornate chamber to signal the start of the hearing. "This session of the House Oversight Committee is now in order," Johnson announced, his voice grave, stating they were there to address concerns raised by several members regarding Federal Bureau of Investigation practices and allegations of politically motivated investigations targeting sitting members of Congress. He looked down at Kash Patel, seated alone at the witness table with no handlers flanking him and no public relations team whispering in his ear. Just him, a leather portfolio, and a glass of water. "Director Patel, thank you for appearing voluntarily today." Kash adjusted his microphone, the feedback whining slightly before settling, and thanked the chairman, stating he was happy to answer any questions the committee had. His voice was steady and professional, the voice of someone who had been through 1,000 of these hearings and knew exactly how the theater of Washington functioned. He knew the traps, and he knew how to evade them. Ilhan Omar leaned into her own microphone, dressed for battle in a bold purple hijab and a tailored black suit, her eyes sharp and confident as she scanned the notes prepared by her staff. This was her moment, and she had been preparing for weeks, telling her supporters that this would be the day the FBI was held accountable. "Director Patel," her voice cut through the room like a blade, "I am going to get straight to the point, because the American people deserve direct answers." She paused for effect, letting the cameras find her face to ensure the framing was perfect. Over the past 6 months, multiple progressive members of Congress have reported being followed, having their communications monitored, and being subjected to what can only be described as harassment by federal law enforcement. This committee has received multiple whistleblower reports. credible reports suggesting that the FBI is maintaining active surveillance operations on at least a dozen sitting members of Congress. The room buzzed with anticipation as journalists leaned forward with pens poised, for this was the accusation they had come to witness. Omar's voice rose slightly, gathering momentum, stating these aren't random members, Director. They are progressives. They are Muslims. They are people of color. They are members who dare to speak truth to power, who criticize American foreign policy, and who demand accountability from institutions like yours. She locked eyes with Kash Patel, her gaze unwavering. So let me start with a simple question. A yes or no question. Is the FBI currently investigating any sitting member of Congress? The trap was set. If he said no, she would produce the whistleblower complaints and accuse him of lying. And if he said yes, she would demand to know why he was targeting her allies. Kash did not hesitate, did not look away, and did not blink. Yes, Congresswoman. The reaction was instantaneous as the room erupted with audible gasps from the gallery, and photographers' cameras clicked like machine guns, creating a wall of mechanical noise. A Republican in the back row actually exclaimed in shock, loud enough for the microphone to catch it. Omar's lips curled into a slight triumphant smile, because she had him right where she wanted him. An admission on live television that the FBI was investigating the legislative branch. And how many of those investigations target Muslim or progressive members, she pressed, ready to deliver the knockout blow. Some of the individuals under investigation identify as progressive, Kash said calmly, his demeanor unchanged by the chaos around him. And some identify as Muslim. But, Congresswoman, I need to clarify something important. Yes or no answers, Director. Omar cut him off, her voice sharp as she wasn't interested in nuance. This is exactly what we feared. Political persecution disguised as law enforcement, targeting members who speak truth to power. Congresswoman, Kash's voice cut through her monologue like a scalpel, not loud or aggressive, just firm. The kind of firmness that stops a room cold. You asked for yes or no, and I gave you yes, but context matters in law. So may I provide it? Omar waved her hand dismissively, confident in her position, saying he could provide it after answering her questions. Director, have you personally authorized surveillance on any member of this committee? Behind the scenes in the gallery, 3 rows back, Omar's lawyer had stopped taking notes and was shaking his head frantically, his lips moving silently to say no. Don't ask that. Don't open that door. But Omar did not see him, as she was riding high on her opening success, fueled by the adrenaline of the confrontation. She was so sure she was the prosecutor in this scenario that she did not see she had just walked into her own trial. Kash? Patel took a slow, deliberate breath and looked at the Congresswoman with an expression that was hard to read, part patience and part warning. Congresswoman, he began, I don't personally authorize individual surveillance, as that is not the role of the director. However, I do review and approve investigation recommendations from field offices when they meet the probable cause standards established by federal law. He leaned forward slightly, his hands still clasped. So, to answer your question, if a member of this committee is under investigation, it is because career FBI agents, not political appointees and not me, found evidence of potential federal crimes serious enough to warrant one. Omar scoffed, a derisive sound caught by her microphone and broadcast to 47 million viewers. Potential federal crimes, she mocked, saying, that is a very convenient phrase, Director, a catch-all for anyone you disagree with. So care to elaborate on what crimes you are accusing sitting members of Congress of committing? The room became very quiet. Even the journalists stopped typing. and the air pressure in the chamber seemed to drop. Kash looked at her for a long moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind, and calculating the blast radius of what was about to happen. When he spoke, his voice was measured and almost gentle. "Congresswoman, are you sure you want me to answer that question in open session on live television?" This was the warning, the last exit ramp, the final chance to turn back. Her lawyer was half out of his seat now, trying desperately to catch her eye and signal the abort code. But Ilhan Omar's pride would not let her back down, not in front of the cameras, and not with the whole progressive movement watching. She had come here to destroy Kash Patel's credibility and paint him as a partisan hack, so she couldn't show weakness now. "Director Patel," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I asked you a direct question. So what crimes are you accusing members of Congress of?" Kash held her gaze for another beat, then nodded slowly, like a man who had just been given permission to do something he had been reluctant to do but was now fully committed to executing. "I haven't accused anyone, Congresswoman," he said, "but since you are asking for specifics in an open session, let's talk about the evidence." He signaled to an aide standing by the wall, a young man holding a stack of files who moved quickly and efficiently to distribute sealed folders to every committee member on the dais. The folders were distinctive with bright red covers and official markings, each one stamped with bold black ink, stating they were cleared for public session. The room erupted into controlled chaos as members frantically grabbed the folders and broke the seals, Republicans' jaws dropping as they scanned the first page with eyes widening in disbelief, while Democrats speed-read looking for the trap or a way to object. Omar's hands were shaking slightly as she reached for her folder, just slightly. But the high-definition cameras zoomed in, catching the tremor as she broke the seal. Kash waited patiently while they read, his hands remaining folded on the table and his expression neutral, looking like a professor waiting for his students to finish a quiz they hadn't studied for. "What you are looking at," he said finally, his voice cutting through the rustling paper, "are redacted summaries of 3 ongoing FBI investigations involving campaign finance violations, wire fraud, and potential Foreign Agents Registration Act violations involving current House members." He paused, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. "These summaries have been cleared by the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel and the Office of Government Ethics specifically for this hearing, at your request for transparency." Omar looked up from her folder, her eyes wide and the confidence draining from her face like water from a cracked glass. "This is highly irregular," she stammered, her voice losing its edge, claiming you can't just distribute active investigation files. "Congresswoman," Kash's voice was sharp now, not angry, just precise like a surgeon making an incision. "You called this hearing. You demanded transparency about FBI investigations into members of Congress, and you summoned me here to answer questions about those investigations." He gestured to the red folder in her hands, stating he was providing exactly the transparency she demanded. He paused again, letting the implications sink in, adding that if she preferred to discuss this in a closed session, he was happy to reconvene in a sensitive, compartmented information facility. So if she would like to stop, just say the word. She was trapped, and everyone watching knew it. If she demanded a closed session now, she would look like she was hiding something and guilty. But if she continued, she had no idea what was coming next. Her pride made the choice for her. "I have nothing to hide, Director," she said, though her voice was defensive now, the bravado from 5 minutes ago already evaporating into the ether. "Let's continue right here, but I want to be clear that this seems like a coordinated attack. Congresswoman, may I ask you a question?" Omar blinked, thrown off balance, saying this was her question time. "Of course," Kash said smoothly, Then let me answer your original question more specifically. Kash opened his own red folder, turning the page with a deliberate, crisp sound. You asked what crimes we are investigating when it involves members of Congress. So let me start with Case File 2021 DC 4478. He looked down at the page, reading the numbers, then back up at her. It involves $2.7 million in campaign expenditures paid to a consulting firm owned by an individual with whom the candidate allegedly had an undisclosed personal relationship during the period of payment. The investigation began after a formal complaint filed in March 2020, alleging that campaign funds were used for personal expenses in violation of Federal Election Commission regulations and potentially constituting wire fraud under federal statute. The room had gone completely silent, and you could hear the air conditioning humming in the ceiling. Omar's face had gone pale, her makeup standing out in stark relief against her skin. "Director?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you discussing my campaign?" Kash looked at her with something that might have been sympathy or the cold calculation of a chess player who just announced checkmate. "Congresswoman, you asked what crimes we investigate when it involves sitting members of Congress, and I am giving you a specific example. If the details sound familiar, that is because they are drawn from public complaints, financial disclosures, and documents obtained through lawful investigative process." Republican Jim Jordan leaned into his microphone, sensing blood in the water. "Director Patel, to clarify for the record, is Congresswoman Omar currently under FBI investigation?" Kash didn't take his eyes off Omar. "Congressman Jordan, I cannot confirm or deny the identity of specific subjects in ongoing investigations without approval. But what I can say is that the case file involves a sitting House member representing Minnesota's 5th Congressional District. Everyone in that room knew there was only one House member from Minnesota's 5th District, and she was sitting right there with white knuckles gripping the edge of the table, realizing that the hunter had just become the hunted. "This is outrageous!" Ilhan Omar's voice cracked, rising an octave as it echoed off the mahogany walls, the composure she had maintained for the cameras shattering. She gripped her microphone stand as if she could physically throttle the accusation hanging in the air, shouting that he was using this hearing to publicly smear her without any due process and calling it a political hit job. Kash Patel's voice remained infuriatingly steady, a calm baritone cutting through her shrill protest. It was the contrast that was killing her. The more she raised her voice, the more reasonable he sounded. "I am answering your questions, Congresswoman," he said simply. "You asked for specifics, and I am providing them, so would you like me to stop?" The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. Omar looked frantically at her lawyer, who was shaking his head and mouthing the word "stop." But she couldn't. To stop now would be an admission, to flee the battlefield she had chosen. Half the progressive movement was watching. CNN was watching. She took a breath, trying to gather the scattered remnants of her dignity. "Fine, Director," she said, though her voice lacked its earlier fire. "Let's talk specifics. You mentioned campaign expenditures, but campaign spending is legal, and hiring consultants is legal. So what exactly is the allegation here?" That was when Kash Patel opened the red folder completely. "The allegation, Congresswoman, is that campaign funds were used for personal benefit." He looked down at his notes, specifically that payments totaling $2.7 million to the E Street Group, a firm owned by Tim Minot, were not for legitimate campaign services, but rather were a mechanism to funnel donor money into a shared household. Omar insisted that the group provided digital strategy, fundraising consulting, and travel logistics, regurgitating the talking points her team had prepared months ago. "We looked at that," Patel said. "Now, I'm not a campaign finance expert, So I had our team do some comparative research. We looked at comparable campaigns with similar district sizes, demographics, and fundraising profiles. He pulled out a chart. We looked at Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's campaign, which has a very active digital presence and national fundraising base similar to yours. In the 2018 election cycle, her campaign paid their primary digital consulting firm $47,000 for the entire cycle. He let that number land. $47,000. In that same period, your campaign paid the E Street Group $890,000. A murmur rippled through the gallery. That is 19 times the industry standard for a district with half the population density of some others. So naturally, the FBI asked what the E Street Group did to earn 19 times the going rate. Omar opened her mouth, closed it, and looked at her lawyer again, who was scribbling furiously on a legal pad but looked pale. We couldn't find documentation of services rendered that justified that volume, Patel continued, noting that her filings list the payments as vague digital consulting and travel expenses. So we dug deeper. He pulled out another document, this one dense with numbers highlighted in bright yellow. In April 2019, your campaign paid the E Street Group $275,000 in a single month, which is $250,000 in 30 days. We traced where that money actually went, Patel said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush that forced the room to lean in. The E Street Group received the payment from your campaign on the 4th, and then made disbursements within 48 hours. $18,000 went to Sterling Crisis Communications, a real firm doing crisis management, which is a legitimate expense. He looked up at her, his eyes locking onto hers. But that is only $18,000 out of $275,000. So where did the other $257,000 go? The silence was excruciating, and every camera lens in the room felt like it was zooming in on Omar's pores. "Let me help you," Patel said gently. "Our forensic accountants traced the wire transfers. $100,000 went to an LLC registered in Tim Manette's personal name, separate from the E Street Group entity. $75,000 went to a luxury travel company with dates matching Instagram posts showing a 3-week vacation to the Maldives, and $50,000 went to a residential real estate escrow company as a down payment on a townhouse in Georgetown." He pulled out a property record stating the townhouse is currently owned jointly by you and Tim Manette. You could have heard a pin drop in the hearing room, for this wasn't abstract corruption anymore. This was a house, a vacation, cold, hard cash. "So let me ask you again, Congresswoman," Patel said. "Were the personal payment, the Maldives vacation, and the house down payment related to legitimate campaign activities?" Omar's lawyer shot to his feet, requesting to confer with his client immediately. "Sit down, Counselor," Chairman Johnson said firmly, banging the gavel once. "Your client called this hearing, and Director Patel is answering her questions. You may advise her, but you may not disrupt." The lawyer sank back into his chair, looking defeated. Omar looked at him desperately, but he shook his head slightly, as there was no good answer. "I would need to review those specific transactions with my legal team before I could comment," Omar said, her voice barely audible. "That's your right," Patel said. "But just to be clear for the record, you cannot currently explain where $257,000 in campaign funds went in April 2019. Funds that were supposed to be used for your re-election, but instead appear to have funded a personal lifestyle." "Not without reviewing the full documentation," she whispered. Patel nodded slowly like a teacher acknowledging a student who had failed an exam. "Thank you for that answer, Congresswoman, but I'm afraid the pattern doesn't stop there." You could see it on Ilhan Omar's face now. The dawning realization that this wasn't just about one bad month of spending, but an autopsy of her entire public life. And Kash Patel had brought the scalpel. "Let's talk about your tax returns," Patel said, reaching into his seemingly bottomless folder and pulling out yet another document. Jerry Nadler, the Democratic ranking member, leaned forward with a flushed face to object that the director was discussing personal tax information protected under privacy laws. "It's not personal when it involves potential federal crimes," Patel replied calmly, not even looking at Nadler, adding that Omar's federal tax returns from 2014 and 2015 are directly relevant to the investigation regarding perjury and fraud. He turned his attention back to Omar, who was now staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact. "In 2014, you filed your federal taxes jointly with Ahmed Hirsi," Patel stated. "You checked the box for married filing jointly, listed a residential address in Minneapolis, and claimed 3 dependents." He paused. "But according to Minnesota state marriage records, you were also legally married to Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi during that exact same period." Omar's head snapped up, her face going from pale to ashen gray. "Your marriage to Mr. Elmi was registered with the state in 2009, Patel continued reading from a certified document, "and it wasn't legally dissolved until 2017. So help me understand this, Congresswoman. How did you file joint federal tax returns with Ahmed Hirsi while you were legally married to Ahmed Elmi?" "That was a cultural marriage," Omar stammered, her voice shaking, claiming, "It is complicated, and the IRS doesn't understand their traditions." "The IRS doesn't recognize complicated as a legal category," Patel said, his voice maddeningly calm. "You are either married or you are not under federal law, and if you filed taxes claiming marriage to one person while legally married to another, that is perjury, making false statements to the federal government, which carries a penalty of up to 5 years in federal prison." He held up a piece of paper, identifying it as Minnesota State Marriage Certificate MC 2009-017854, listing the bride as Ilhan Abdullahi Omar and the groom as Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi, dated February 12, 2009. "This is a legal document," he said, setting it down gently on the table. "So if this marriage certificate is legitimate, then your 2014 tax return filed jointly with a different man is fraudulent. But if this marriage certificate is fraudulent, then we have a different problem. Which is it?" Omar looked at her lawyer, who had stopped whispering and was just staring at the ceiling, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. "These allegations have been debunked," Omar said, desperate to find a lifeline, noting local media looked into this years ago and found nothing. "Local media did reporting," Patel agreed, "but the FBI does investigations, and there's a difference because we have subpoena power, forensic accountants, and the ability to trace records reporters can't see." Republican member James Comer jumped in asking if the IRS is investigating this matter. "The IRS Criminal Investigation Division opened a case in 2021, Patel confirmed, "and the FBI is assisting because there are related immigration concerns." "Immigration," Comer pressed. Kash hesitated for just a moment, a theatrical pause to let the word hang in the air. "Congressman, I probably shouldn't go into detail on that without approval," Patel said, feigning reluctance. "But since Congresswoman Omar opened this door by calling this hearing, our investigation found that Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi applied for U.S. permanent residency status in 2011. On his application, he listed Ilhan Omar as his spouse, and the marriage certificate I just referenced was submitted as the primary supporting documentation. His application was approved." Patel let that sit for a moment. "The concern, and I want to be clear this is still under investigation, is that if you married Mr. Elmi solely to assist with his immigration status while maintaining a concurrent relationship with Ahmed Hirsi, that would constitute immigration marriage fraud. That is a lie, Omar shouted, insisting she married him for love, and it didn't work out. We interviewed 12 witnesses, Patel said, cutting her off with data. People who knew you during that period, including friends, neighbors, and family members. He looked at a summary sheet stating 11 of them declared under oath that you never cohabitated with Ahmed Elmi as spouses. 8 stated you lived with Ahmed Hirsi throughout the entire period, and 3 stated you explicitly told them the marriage was an arrangement to help Elmi get his papers. Omar sat frozen, looking like a statue of herself, perfectly still, except for the trembling of her hands. "Now, Congresswoman, I'm not here to make accusations," Patel said, closing the tax folder. "I'm here to answer your question about what crimes the FBI investigates when it involves sitting members of Congress, and the answer is the same crimes we investigate for anyone else: tax fraud, immigration fraud, campaign finance fraud. We don't care if you're a congresswoman or a convenience store clerk. The law applies equally." But Kash Patel wasn't done. He reached for one final folder, this one thinner and marked with a different color tape. "There is one more area I need to address," he said, "and this one required additional clearance from the DOJ, which I received this morning." The room was already reeling, but Kash Patel didn't give the audience time to breathe as he reached into his portfolio and pulled out the final folder bound in a stark white cover with a single stripe of blue tape. Ilhan Omar watched him open the folder, her hands no longer shaking, but gripping the table so tightly her knuckles looked like polished bone. The fight had drained out of her. In October 2017, Patel began consulting a document stamped secret that had been heavily redacted. You traveled to Istanbul, Turkey. While there, you met with officials from the Qatari government, specifically representatives from the embassy and the Qatar Foundation. Omar's eyes widened slightly, thinking this was safe ground, foreign policy and diplomacy. "I meet with foreign officials all the time," she interjected, her voice thin. "Absolutely correct," Patel agreed. But here is what caught the FBI's attention. Within 6 months of those meetings in Istanbul, you became very publicly critical of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, introducing legislation to block arms sales and tweeting about human rights, which is your right. However, you were notably silent on Qatar's human rights record despite similar issues, and in fact praised their role as a mediator. "I speak out where I think it is appropriate," Omar argued. "Then explain this," Patel cut her off, sliding a spreadsheet across the table. "In 2018, 2019, and 2020, your campaign and leadership PAC received a combined $187,000 in donations from individuals and entities with documented business ties to Qatari state interests." He pointed to the list of donors with direct contractual relationships with Qatar Airways and the Qatar Foundation. Omar was flipping frantically through her folder, staring at the list of names she knew, people whose hands she had shaken. "Receiving donations is legal," Patel continued, his voice tightening. "But there is a law called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA." He leaned forward, locking eyes with hers. "FARA requires anyone who acts as an agent of a foreign government or advocates for their interests in exchange for compensation to register with the Department of Justice." "I am not a foreign agent," Omar snapped, finding a spark of indignation. "Congresswoman," Patel said calmly, "if you advocated for specific policy positions favorable to Qatar in exchange for financial support, that requires FARA registration." "I never received any personal payments from a foreign government," she insisted. "I didn't say personal payments," Patel corrected her. I said campaign donations and support for affiliated organizations. If the money was a quid pro quo for the policy stance, it is a crime. He watched her carefully. She was cornered but still fighting, needing one final push. You say there is no connection, Patel said, but the FBI doesn't rely on coincidences. We rely on evidence. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, placing it face down on the table. The FBI obtained through a lawfully executed warrant WhatsApp messages between you and an intermediary, a Qatari national with direct ties to the royal court. The color drained from Omar's face so completely she looked like a ghost, as the mention of WhatsApp sucked the remaining oxygen out of the room. I can't read the messages verbatim, Patel said, tapping the folder, but I can summarize. The messages discuss, and I quote the classified summary, compensation for advocacy on Gulf policy issues and ensuring favorable congressional stance on the upcoming Qatar sanctions vote. Patel looked up, asking if she would like to explain what that phrase meant. The room was dead silent, every eye on Omar, the cameras zoomed in tight on the sweat on her forehead. She turned to her lawyer, whispering frantically, but he shook his head violently with pleading eyes. Finally, she turned back to the microphone, her voice trembling. I need to see the actual messages before I can respond, she said. They are in your folder on page 47, Patel repeated. Omar flipped to page 47, her hands shaking so badly the paper made a rattling sound. She stared at the page for an eternity in television time as the entire country watched a sitting congresswoman read the evidence of her own compromise. Her face went from ashen to white. Congresswoman Omar, do you need a moment to consult with your attorney? Chairman Johnson asked. I need to consult with my attorney, she whispered. That is your right, Patel said, his voice almost gentle now. But I need to ask for the record. Given the nature of these documents and the criminal statutes involved, are you invoking your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination regarding the questions about potential FARA violations and your relationship with the Qatari government? And there it was. The moment, 11:47 a.m., the frozen second where everything collapsed. Everyone in that room knew what pleading the Fifth meant. Legally a right, but politically an unconditional surrender. Omar looked at her lawyer one last time, and he nodded reluctantly. On advice of counsel, she said, her voice small and defeated, regarding the questions about the Qatar meetings and the FARA allegations, yes, I am invoking my Fifth Amendment rights. The room exploded with noise, journalists sprinting for the doors, Republicans shouting, and Democrats calling for a recess. Chairman Johnson banged his gavel hard to restore order. But there was no order, only chaos. Kash Patel sat quietly at the witness table, closed his red folder, folded his hands, and waited. He didn't smile or gloat, looking almost sad, like a surgeon who had just delivered a terminal diagnosis. When the room quieted enough, he leaned into the microphone one last time. Congresswoman, invoking your Fifth Amendment rights is completely legal and proper, he said, but I need to inform you as a courtesy that the Department of Justice will likely request an expedited review of all aspects of the case file. The hearing was over, and the gavel fell along with the political life of Ilhan Omar. She didn't linger, moving with a phalanx of staffers forming a human shield to block the press, bursting out of the double doors and sprinting toward the elevators. But escape was an illusion. She could leave the building, but not the digital blast radius. By 1:00 p.m., the indictment was the #1 trending topic worldwide. The internet had weaponized the hearing faster than any news cycle. Even her own party's silence was deafening, with statements that were weak or non-existent. The day ended with a single image dominating the news. Omar's face frozen in that moment of realization at 11:47 a.m. The next 48 hours saw the complete structural collapse of her political standing, with major newspapers laying out the timeline of corruption and moderate Democrats leaking that she should step aside. By day 3, the House Ethics Committee announced a review, and a vote was scheduled to remove her from the Foreign Affairs Committee. The final tally was 312 to 119, with 67 Democrats crossing the aisle to vote yes, a vote of no confidence from her own colleagues. 3 weeks later, the Department of Justice announced a 51-count indictment against her, including wire fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. Her career ended the moment the indictment hit the wires. A primary challenger emerged. Polling showed her losing by a landslide, and her inner circle collapsed. Through it all, Kash Patel said nothing, simply going back to work, because to him, it was just an investigation based on facts. 3 months later, a staffer reflected that Patel knew she would demand transparency and prepared accordingly, understanding that transparency cuts both ways. She brought a narrative to a gunfight. He brought the documents.